Okay, why don't we get started here for our second panel? This panel I think is going to focus on our second report, slow and steady, improving U.S.-Arab cooperation to counter irregular warfare, which really was a report focused on looking at we have these challenges posed by Salafi jihadist groups. We have these challenges posed by Iran. None of these challenges are actually at sort of the conventional level. They're much more at the asymmetric level. Is it possible to find ways to work with our Arab partners to be more effective in this space? And more generally, like thinking about how we work with our Arab partners, who we need if we're going to be achieving some of the objectives we lay out and sort of just basic objectives for American foreign policy, especially in the context that we were talking about earlier today with Dazdi Mulroy in the first session about the fact that realistically the U.S. is to some extent trying to pull back or at least reduce its investment in the Middle East. Well, you can't do that unless you have strong friends and partners who you can work with, who you can rely on. So we have, I think, the perfect panel, as far as I'm concerned, to talk about these questions. Three people who I really both like and deeply respect and who are just such experts on this issue. So we have Mara Karlin over on the left. Mara is an associate professor of the practice of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. I always have a hard time with all these acronyms. She's also serves as the school's director, or the director of the school's strategic studies program, and the executive director of the Merrill Center of Strategic Studies. And before this, she spent a long time at DoD, worked for 5 U.S. Secretaries of Defense in a number of different positions, including on the Middle East, and also in her last position as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Deployment. Next to her, we have Ken Pollock. Ken is anybody who's been following the Middle East and paying attention to think tank scholars for the last 20 years knows exactly who Ken is, so doesn't need much introduction. He is currently he's the resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He was previously a senior fellow at the Brookings Center. He was also for a while a director of the Saban Center there. And he had a distinguished government career, including a couple of tours at the NSC, working on various Middle East issues and years at the CIA. And finally, right next to me, we have Brian Katz. Brian is a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And he was previously the director for Syria and OSD policy in the Middle East office from 2016 to 17, really during the height of the counter-ISIS campaign, and also has spent years in the intelligence community. And so, like I said, couldn't imagine 3 people better equipped to talk about these challenges, especially since they've all written deeply, especially on this question of working with partners and engaging in the Middle East. Before we get into sort of the nooks and crannies of the report and these questions, I really want to start with a general question that sort of overlies everything in the region. And maybe I'll start, Mara, with you with this, but I really would like for all of you guys to be able to answer this. And it's, our report spends a lot of time talking about, the challenges the U.S. policy has had in the region in the last 20 years. I like to compare it to sort of a yo-yo diet. Like we just go in and out, without ever, which is incredibly unhealthy, without ever actually finding, what is that stable way to eat? What is that stable way to think about the region and approach it? So even going back to the Bush administration, President Bush comes in and the argument is great power competition in the Middle East isn't that important and we don't need all these small conflicts. And then 9/11 and the next 8 years, his entire presidency is defined by the Middle East in many ways. So then President Obama comes in and he says, well, we're going to leave Iraq, and he campaigns on leaving Iraq. And eventually we do leave Iraq. And then ISIS comes up, and we are back in Iraq again, and are still there now. And so, again, this sort of up and down. And then President Trump has come in really under the, and during his campaign, again, it was, I'm going to defeat ISIS, and I'm going to leave the Middle East. And, we had a number of announcements about leaving Syria that now have been, to a great extent, walked back. But the bottom line is there's still this desire to leave the region. And, again, we're hearing great power is great power, great power. That's all you hear around town these days. But it seems to me, unless we figure out how to get the Middle East at least right, we're going to continue to suck back into these challenges. Sorry, guys. I maybe went a little longer as a moderator there than I should have, but I feel like this is an important point. So, it's a really important question. Like, what are our interests, and really, what is a sustainable long-term approach in the region? So maybe, Mara, I'll ask you to go first, especially since you wrote a foreign affairs piece about this just a few months ago that was, quite discussed a lot in D.C. So maybe we can start with you and ask.
Super. Thank you, Ilan, and thanks for bringing us together. This is a terribly fun group, and I'm really excited about it. So I like the yo-yo diet. The term that I've used with my co-author Tamara Kaufman-Wittes is purgatory. And that has been kind of the approach that we've thought about with the U.S. Vis-a-vis the Middle East over recent decades. Effectively, we're too involved to focus on other things, but we're not involved enough in the Middle East to actually shape those things that we care about. It does come down to what are your priorities. As much as folks may say, gosh, the Middle East is just brimming with all sorts of unpalatable issues and problems, and it sure would be nice to worry about other regions, that is not terribly practical, right? The old joke about Vegas rules, that just doesn't apply to the Middle East. And anyone who sort of might push back on that, I would say, go look at Syria over the last few years and the effect that a destabilized Syria had on European unity and European sovereignty. I don't think that we can buy into that. But we need to think in terms of priorities. So while the U.S. over the last 18 years has really been deeply focused on the Middle East, deeply focused militarily on fighting terrorists and insurgents across the Middle East and sort of Southwest Asia, other challenges have emerged. In particular, this gets at both the issue of great power competition vis-a-vis China and Russia, and the potential for great power conflict vis-a-vis both of those, which is, while still extremely unlikely, is not nearly as unlikely as I think any of us would like us to be. And so you have a U.S. government, and in particular U.S. military, that is focused on one end of the conflict spectrum, hasn't been terribly victorious in that end of the conflict spectrum. That's how it's developed its expertise, while all these other challenges have emerged. So effectively, what I think I've tried to think about vis-a-vis this region is that the opportunity cost has grown substantially. And whenever you're thinking about priorities, you have to worry about opportunity costs. Now, we have to hedge and bet because as much as folks, particularly across the defense apparatus, might want to say, worry about great power competition and conflict, the defense world could be profoundly wrong, as is often the case, myself included. So you do have to hedge and bet. So what does this mean? It means that you find a more sustainable way to have U.S. involvement in the Middle East, particularly militarily. That's a smaller posture and a posture that's more tailored toward the threats you worry about. It means you have a more whole-of-government approach in particular, so throw some money at the State Department, throw some money at USAID. But to the extent possible, you need to rebalance toward focusing on Russia and on China, because we do still have interests in the Middle East. We have to worry about maritime security. We still have to worry about fighting terrorists. We have to worry about a modicum of containing conflict, noting how difficult that is.
So Ken, maybe you can weigh in.
Sure, and I'm not sure how much I disagree with Mara, how much I agree with Mara. I'm just going to lay out my own thinking. You guys can figure it out, because I absolutely agree with Mara's original set of points about the importance of this region and the fact that every time we do, as Ilan has also pointed out, try to walk away, it sucks us back in, right? And I think, Mara, I could be wrong about this, but I think I'm the origin of the phrase that the Middle East is not Las Vegas. What happens there doesn't stay there. You guys can search it. Maybe somebody said it.
Most brilliant comments I have, I read by you at some point.
Thank you. But anyway, this is part of the problem, is that we're endlessly trying to walk away from the region because we are always trying to think about it. And at the most basic level, what Mara said is absolutely correct. When you look at the threat posed by China, when you look at the threat posed by Russia, there's no question about the enormity of those threats. Nevertheless, there is an immediacy to the problems of the Middle East, right? Yes, someday we may fight a war with China. When that day is, who knows? Right now, we have real problems in the Middle East, and those problems in the Middle East are causing us real headaches. Mara mentioned the destabilizing impact of the problems of the Middle East on Europe. I completely agree. We can add in Central Asia. We can now add in the Horn of Africa, right? This is the whole point of this is not Las Vegas. The problems there don't stay there. They spill over, and they are spilling over in big and unexpected ways. Let's also add in the point that we need to keep in mind, which we're endlessly forgetting here, that the world isn't yet ready to live without Middle Eastern oil. We're all enthralled with fracking and shale oil, and perhaps someday we won't have to worry about the Middle East oil. That day is not today, and it's unlikely to be for 10 or 20 or 30 years based on which estimates that you look at. And it is a Middle East that is racked by internal problems and is also, unfortunately, racked by external conflicts. And we, the United States, play a critical role. And one of the big issues that we all have to keep in mind, of course, is that you can never really answer this question definitively, because the only answer to it is based on your interpretation of the past and your expectations of the future. And everyone is entitled to their own interpretation of the past, and there is enough history there to justify almost any course of action that you'd like to justify. And the future, none of us knows. Right? My great concern is that when I look at the Middle East, I see a deeply unstable region that is affecting our interest in terms of its impact with refugees, with terrorism, with the threat to the oil market. By the way, an oil market that is about to become unbelievably tight because of this administration's sanctions on Iran and Venezuela. Right? We're now entering a period when the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are going to have to max out their productive capacity to maintain the current oil price. Right? If there are problems in Libya, if there are problems in Iraq, if there are problems in Algeria, you will see the price of oil spike because of how tight the oil market is becoming. All of this, again, speaks to both the internal problems of the Middle East and also the external. And I'll simply end by saying I do worry very much about how the United States has disengaged from the region over the last 10 years. What I've seen is the problems of the region get worse, not better. Right? And some of that is generated by our own allies. They see Iran moving forward, they see Iran's gains, and they do exaggerate the Iranian threat, and they do overreact to that. But that's baked into this region. It is baked into its problems. And saying that they're idiots and we can just walk away isn't the right answer either. That's how we got the Saudi intervention in Yemen. Right? When that happened, I wrote at the time, that intervening in Yemen it's like the old line about friends not allowing friends to drive drunk. Right? Friends shouldn't let friends invade Yemen. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. And it happened because the Saudis didn't see the United States leading an effort to push back on Iran, and so they tried to do it themselves, and we got the worst outcome of all. And what I fear is if the United States doesn't re-engage and isn't engaged, and I agree with Mara, engagement does not need to look like the surge in Iraq. In fact, engagement should be mostly economic and political, not military. The report is great in talking about smart, creative ways to use limited military power to do this. One of the things I love about this report. But we shouldn't make the mistake of when someone says, like myself, we need to re-engage in the region, that somehow you think it's 160,000 troops and $1 trillion. That's not it at all. That actually wouldn't be helpful at all. But the idea that the United States can walk away from this place, that I think is a terrible mistake, especially because I think that many of these problems could lead to worse internal crises in the future and conceivably lead to a wider war across the region as we see Israel and the Sunni Arabs gearing up on one end and the Iranians and their allies on the other.
Brian, over to you for your response.
Yeah. Well, I make it a general point not to disagree with Mark Karlin. So what I'm going to do is I think maybe reframe the prioritization question. Looking at your report, it's bucketed into two broad threats that we're concerned about. The Sunni Salafi jihadist threat, the transnational terrorism threat, and the Iran threat to the region. For me, looking at one, what are primarily U.S. national security interests, but two, pragmatically, what are the types of things that we're actually capable of pursuing and achieving, I still start first and foremost with the counterterrorism threat. I think that's one, realistically, what will most threaten the U.S. homeland and allies in Europe, but also what the U.S. political system tends to care about more as well. What leads to this yo-yo diet? The intervention back into Iraq, the desire to get to Raqqa and Syria as fast as possible, the re-intervention into Libya to go after ISIS and Sirte. These are the types of things that I think inevitably, regardless of the administration, are going to drive it. given that reality, I think smart investments in a small but enduring, emphasis on enduring presence across the region is critical to do this. One, these terrorist groups are smart and adaptable. If you don't have a presence there for intelligence collection, for military operations, whether it's by, with, and through local partners, or in some cases unilateral for the United States, the groups are going to adapt. So that you need that presence. Second, kind of to Ken's point, there's beyond the military and intel, there's the political element of this as well, which is thinking in terms of a long-term investment in our partners. I think this will apply to the Iranian example, but particularly here, thinking through, instead of thinking of our military operations in the Middle East as these discrete one-off missions to go after a target, to think through 10, 20, 30 years, what are the things we want in this country and region, and how can we, working through local actors, build their political, economic, media capabilities for them to become legitimate actors that then become better for us to work by, with, and through. In some ways, this is thinking and acting more like the Iranian approach to the region. Identifying those who share your ideological worldview, but also demonstrating a commitment to go fight with you on wherever the battlefield across the region. Well, your report talks to this as well, this idea of a more regional mindset for some of our closest partners. After the pure threat against ISIS or Al-Qaeda, I do rank the Iranian threat after that. I view it more through the prism of sort of influence and competition over the long term in the region, vice a key U.S. national security threat. The threat is primarily to Israel, and through our alliance with Israel, our commitment to defend them. But for the United States, for me, it's this idea of that long-term investment again. And not taking your ball and going home whenever Iran gains influence in another country. Right? There are certain, for an Iranian strategy for the United States, you need to accept certain realities. Iran is going to have influence in Lebanon through Hezbollah. They're going to have influence in Syria through Bashar al-Assad. They're going to have influence in Iraq through the Hashd al-Shaabi. They're going to have influence in Yemen because of the Houthis. That doesn't mean that you give up or you concede it, and that doesn't mean that you go to war with that. It means that you think long term and find those partners. You don't give up. You continue investing in their capabilities, and you provide them political support. One can't predict what the Middle East chessboard is going to look like 10 years from now, let alone 1 year. So it's good to actually have some players on the board.
Yeah, and I mean, you talked about sort of, again, I'm going to do my little prerogative of the moderator to make a little editorial point, which is only to say that, you talk about a sustained long-term presence in the Middle East. And I agree with that, by the way, in a place like Syria or Iraq. And I actually, there's this fiction out there, I think at least it's a fiction, that the American public's not going to let that happen, that we always have to be driving towards an exit. The American public will not let 150,000 troops sit in a country long-term, taking significant amounts of casualties. That was not sustainable, and a strategy based on that was not sustainable. But, a small, long-term American presence, it's part of the point of the report is, specifically engineered to deal with certain conflicts where we're not taking major casualties, where we're not spending as much money, but we're still having some positive impact. That's completely sustainable. And the public doesn't really care that much about that, I think is the bottom line reality, unless politicians generate it or convince themselves. But I don't think, I don't think 2020 is going to be decided on based on if, even from the base, based on if somebody says, well, I want to keep 2,000 troops in Syria. I just don't think it's going to make a difference. And so I think there's a lot more space there, too, the politicians give themselves. And a lot of this is, some of us were talking even before the panel about Iraq hang-ups, which are still there, I think, from 2003 and impact so much of American decision-making. But Brian, I'm going to stick with you for a minute and shift us over from the broader questions into some specific questions for all three of you. And, one of the things that the report argues is, the counter-ISIS model is the right model for dealing with these sort of low-intensity threats. It's this combination, and actually, I think Dasdi Molroy also mentioned this in the first session. It's a combination of working with local partners on the ground, non-state actors or state actors, whoever has the legitimacy in the space. Providing unique capabilities only the United States can provide. Using that investment then for diplomatic leverage, because we have more diplomatic leverage than most. And also combining it with investment on the ground in terms of long-term development / sustainability, stabilization. But you've written a report, for CSIS, imperfect proxies, the pros and perils of working with non-state actors on CT. So, I'm going to give you guys all a shout out here because everybody's sitting on this panel because they've actually written a pretty specific report or book on this topic. So, what were your conclusions about, because, is this approach sustainable? It's kind of hard to, working with the SDF is not exactly an easy thing. Working with some of these different groups on the ground, some of our experiences in Syria not been so good, weapons getting out to God knows who, and things like that. What have you taken in terms of, and from your time at DoD, in terms of how we work with non-state actors?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first just evaluating the counter-ISIS campaign, having been there at the beginning in the Pentagon during its development and its execution, to now out in think tank land, sort of observing it as an analyst, a remarkable achievement in terms of its effectiveness in achieving its military objective, which was the territorial defeat of ISIS as a caliphate holding territory and its sort of conventional and semi-conventional military forces. What it has lacked is any type of political strategy to accompanying it. It wasn't there at the beginning, and now we are playing catch-up to use our military presence there to affect some type of diplomatic resolution to it, and you're seeing the struggles with that play out. So the question is, how did we get to this place? And again, this is a unique case in Syria, but not across the region, where now the United States or other Western allies have been using the by, with, and through model, which we've used with partner nations for decades across the region and elsewhere in the world, to now looking through the lens of non-state actors, working by, with, and through local proxies. Now, the fundamental question is, why are you working with a non-state actor in the first place? Well, that's because there's no state actor that you're either able or willing to work with. That means you're probably in the state of a civil war where there's fragmentation and broad chaos with sort of multiple overlapping conflicts that we see throughout the region's civil wars. That means, though your intent is to intervene sort of purely for counterterrorism region, by the nature of your intervention and the fact that you're working with a militia who by their nature are probably of a sect or of a ethnic group, you are becoming a player in that civil conflict. It is a reality. So not having a political strategy to accompany your military operations that accounts for that reality means that you're constantly going to be playing catch-up when you complete military operations and you're looking for some type of political resolution. So my main takeaway is, before you launch military operations, is to not think about stability after you achieve your objective and a diplomatic element of that, but it needs to be part of your planning from the ground up. In terms of the campaign, right, there's pros and cons to this approach. There's a reason this was chosen, and it wasn't because of a lack of knowledge of the region or a lack of intellect. It's that there's real trade-offs in this approach, but there's pros and cons. When you look at motivation and capability of these actors, capability, right? One benefit of working with a militia is that they're an established fighting force. You're not building one from scratch, but they've been involved in a civil conflict. They have existing capabilities. So with U.S. enabling, whether it's intelligence or training, they can become a pretty effective ground force when you don't want to use your own forces fairly quickly. The con is that they might be good at clearing territory, but it doesn't mean they're good at holding, or they might be ill-suited to being the stabilization force for that area. Again, a militia going into another area to clear probably a group of a different ethnicity, given the nature of the war, means that you are becoming part of that civil conflict, even though you had counterterrorism objectives. In terms of motivation, right? The pro is that this militia may perceive the threat from these terrorist groups similar to you, as an almost existential one. Right? Think if you're the YPG, you're the Syrian Kurds in northeast Syria, and ISIS is marching to crush you and your people in Kobani in 2014. That's going to give you strong incentive to want to partner with an outside player who shares that threat. The con is, we've saying sort of by, with, and through. By, with, and who? Are you sure what are the real motivations of these actors you're working with? They may be committed to fighting against the terrorist adversary now, but they may have multiple adversaries, some that go back decades, that once that terrorism objective is met, they may turn their attention to, as we're seeing what's happening with the YPG and relations with Turkey. So my main suggestion at the end of this is, one, at the beginning, acknowledging that you are going to have a trade-off between counterterrorism and stability by going through this approach. Acknowledging that, and doing the best you can, again, as you're designing your campaign, to have a clear political strategy that accompanies it. It's not going to be perfect, it's going to be difficult, but if you can't articulate it and you're not resourcing and planning for it from the beginning, you're going to be playing catch up, and it's going to get harder and harder as you go along.
So now let me turn back to Mara. And, you've, as I said, everybody's written something here. You've written a book, a PhD actually, on, building militaries in fragile states, which you looked at sort of the challenges for the U.S. and, why security assistance often fails. And we've tried to take into account some of your recommendations in the way we've put our report together, to try to, talk about doing things like joint strategies from the beginning, getting in from the ground up in particular, doing campaign plans, discussing even things like what are ethical approaches to combating this. I mean, all that in some ways and importantly, also having an evaluation mechanism at the end to make sure you're actually evaluating what you're doing. So all those were sort of shout outs to some of the work that you've done. But I'm curious as to your take, what are the biggest challenges that the U.S. faces when doing, security assistance and with working with these partners, and, specifically, what can we be doing in the Middle East in your view?
Absolutely. I mean, thank you for that. I thought the report is superb because it does push so many of those hard issues out. And, if you leave here with just one thought, I think it's very much what Brian is saying, which is be willing to have some really hard and uncomfortable inside the family discussions, right? Careful of believing your talking points that you might say outside. Inside the U.S. government, be willing to look at one another and say, all right, no kidding, what are we trying to do here? And do we have evidence that it's actually working or not? And so the challenge is, best case scenario, everything we're saying happens under this rubric of a whole of government approach in which we are building capable states that respond to their needs of their citizens. That would be terrific. That's probably not going to happen for a whole bunch of reasons. The U.S. system isn't well set up for that. A lot of our partners might not be terribly enthusiastic about that. We are a system of checks and balances in which we have elections pretty regularly and folks change policies. So while academically the best case scenario is this whole of government, really thoughtful, long-term sustainable approach, practically speaking, that might not happen. So that is, I think, huge on our challenge list. I think another huge point is this issue of honesty. What are we, no kidding, trying to achieve here? Is there evidence that it will work? And as it's going on, is there evidence that it is working? That is profoundly uncomfortable, right? These are all ugly options, right? When you're working by, with, and through, your options are usually awful or catastrophic. Do I want to try to work with a force that may be operationally effective, but I'm not sure that in the long term I really trust them? And in fact, they lead to all sorts of profound dilemmas geostrategically. That's what we bought ourselves in Syria. That's one option. Or do I want to send, tens of thousands of U.S. troops to deal with this problem? That's another option. I also don't like that one. So that's sort of what we're juggling here is recognizing sort of the ugly versus the hideous as we're trying to weigh these. Other challenges, I had opened up talking about opportunity costs, and I do think those opportunity costs are increasing. While the U.S. has been so focused on the Middle East, fighting terrorists, fighting insurgents since 9/11, that is shifting whether we like it or not. And the dilemma will be, to what extent is it actually going to shift? I had said earlier, and I think Ken had echoed earlier, that you've got these real challenges in the region, particularly terrorism. I do think that is spot on. And yet, my fear is that if the U.S. gets into a shooting war with China and Russia, it will make terrorist attacks look like a vacation at Disney World. So we have some really profound challenges that are now increasingly distracting us and going to make this all a whole lot more complicated, unfortunately.
Yeah, and all right, so, and I wanted to now turn to Ken and give him one and talk about, some of the things that we took out of your book and your two books actually on this topic. And most important, Armies of Sand, which is Ken's newest book, looking at Arab militaries and the reasons they've failed. And we tried to address some of those recommendations in our report. But I'm interested to hear from you, Ken, your assessment, first of why Arab militaries have failed and the struggles that they've generally had, in like a few minutes, as opposed to like the 1,000 pages I think you've written between two books on the topic. So, and also, why, one of the key recommendations of the report is, work with smaller forces, groups like the, CTS in Iraq, and why those tend to work better and why we seem to have had more success in building out forces like that in the past.
Sure, great question, Ilan. Let me do this. Let me pick up where Mara left off, because I thought you made a really nice point at the end, and use that to kind of talk a little bit in particular about why I think the report is so spot on in terms of how we should be thinking about moving forward and how it does very much flow from my own work. So first, Mara made this really important point about having some hard conversations with ourselves about why we're doing this stuff, right? And I'll start by picking that up and saying that, what we have to recognize is that we've been training Arab militaries for more or less 70 years, right? And the truth is that for the first, 60, 65 of those years maybe, it was all a charade. We pretended to teach them, and they pretended to learn, right? And everyone understood that it was a charade, right? Now, when I say that we pretended to teach them, please don't get me wrong. We sent many, many very earnest young men and women over to the Middle East who really thought that initially they were going to train them and make a difference. Right? The problem there is that the United States, the way the U.S. military conceives of itself, is that we have found the solution to how to fight. It is a universal solution applicable to all people everywhere. Right? That's nonsense. As Raymond Aron once famously said, every military is the product of its society. Our military system works for our society, for our people. And the method that we have of training young 18-year-old men and women works for young American 18-year-old men and women. Okay? You can't just walk into another country and expect to train an Egyptian 18-year-old the same way that you would train an American 18-year-old. Right? And it is, we're trying to teach them to do things that make no sense to them. We developed a military system for our society. It works really well for our society. It doesn't necessarily work well for other societies. Right? And the societies that we have really helped to build capacity with, they've typically taken our ideas and made them their own. Right? The Israelis famously take all of our equipment and modify it for their own activities. Right? We learned as much from the Israelis about doctrine and tactics as they learned from us. And in fact, they learned mostly from the Germans, not from us at all. Right? The places where we've helped, it's because we had allies who had the capacity to take what we were presenting them and make it their own. In the Arab world, they do not have that capacity. And I'm not going to give you a long explanation of what's in my book. If you're interested, Armies of Sand, the past, present, and future of Arab military effectiveness, you can get it at 30% off from Amazon, right? And that really takes you through it. But the bottom line is that Arab society, its politics, its economics, its culture, its educational system, just create a very different structure. It creates a very different way of thinking about things, of organizing hierarchies and organizations in particular. And the problem that the Arabs have had for the last 60, 70 years is that while that method of organization works fine for them in their own context, it doesn't lend itself to how modern war is fought. In every period of time, warfare, because of the technology that's available, calls for certain skill sets. Arab society does not generate enough people with that skill set, right? The way that Israeli society, for instance, does. Right? Now that may change in the future. The Arabs are not doomed to this. It's a momentary thing. What's wonderful about your report, what I tried to talk about in my book, what I've talked about in other articles as well, is that there are ways to work around that. Right? And your book really nicely picked up on one of the most important ways to work around that, right? Which is to recognize that skills are distributed unevenly in a society. And that even though Arab society may not generate large numbers of people with these skills, it still generates people with these skills. And the smartest thing that we can do, what we actually learn to do in Operation Inherent Resolve, in particular, what Sean McFarlane did in Iraq, and Sean does not get enough credit for this, right, was to recognize we can help identify those Iraqis who have the right skill set, right, and we take them and we put them all in the counterterrorism service, in the Golden Division, right? So that's the first thing that you want to do. The second thing, again, inherent in your report, eliteness. Eliteness has its own virtues, right? These are elite formations. They have a certain esprit. People want to do this. It gives them a commitment and a willingness to fight that you don't always see in the line formations, right? And so you get a small number of people with the right skills, with the right commitment. Typically they're volunteers. And then the last piece is then you can bring in the training, right? Those are people who can benefit from the training. And you partner them with our personnel and you give them advisors and guidance, and you can create a force that is unquestionably better than most of the Army. Now, I want to make one last point before you move off of me, which is that your report is really good about always making the point that this is about a force that's going to be small and it's going to be competent at irregular warfare. We have a very bad habit in the United States, and the English language is wonderful, but it's ambiguous as hell. We often assume that the term irregular warfare is a synonym for insurgency or counterinsurgent warfare. And you guys are great about making the point that that's not it at all, right? And the thing to understand there is that while this kind of a force can certainly be helpful in counterinsurgency, it's actually not what you want for counterinsurgency. In counterinsurgency, the most important thing that you need is population security. And that requires large, large numbers of personnel. So I think you guys are absolutely right that we need to build out things like the Muhawirs in Lebanon and the CTS in Iraq. We should not assume that that gives us the basis for a counterterrorism service, or sorry, a COIN force, excuse me, which requires a much larger number of people.
Those types of forces can, at least hopefully over time, also if they're ever able to pick up an expeditionary capacity, can help with that kind
Exactly.
of help.
Train 'em.
Local actors, they can be, train the trainer. I mean, this is one of the central ideas, right? Is like if you can build these elite, for Arab forces in countries that aren't dealing with major instability internally, they can help with some of their neighbors who are dealing with major instability and actually help train them. And that's less that the U.S. has to do. Or, although importantly, the U.S. will need to continue to play a part in this too, and we try to make that point very clearly from the beginning. This isn't a substitute for American engagement, because that will never work.
Ilan, can I add one
Yeah,
point on this?
go for it.
Because I think Ken is spot on about this idea of working with these elite forces. They're going to be the right folks. They're going to get the right capabilities. I think that's spot on. It is simultaneously true, though, that when we are working with these elite forces, we need to have a deep and textured understanding of who they are, making sure they're not all, say, from one sect or from one part of the country, because if the most capable folks all happen to be from either of those, that's going to then kind of muck about all, sensitive issues with the country that we may or may not want to buy ourselves.
Yeah, you can totally fundamentally, inadvertently change the situation in the country. Yeah, balance of power internally.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that. It goes back to the earlier point of having a long-term view and investment. Your ability to both identify who those people are who can become the leaders of these special operations organizations, and to build the trust and rapport to get that alignment of strategy, operations, tactics comes over time. So the more you commit to it, the better ultimately that you're going to be able to identify, train, and deploy those forces in concert with your advisors.
So with that, I'm going to give us a few minutes for Q&A. So if anybody, I'll take maybe a couple of questions. We'll do 2 rounds. We'll take a couple of questions, and we'll do another round. So I see one right up here.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sylwia Szaflowska. I'm the Polish Assistant Defense Attaché. This discussion is just great. With all your knowledge, and I've been dealing with the Middle East issues for many, many years. With all your experience you have, your footprint, sometimes I have an impression that U.S. policy in the Middle East is like in a squash room. You don't know where the ball hits you. What can be done to, especially in terms of Syria, which, in my terms, Russia got stronger. The chaos is horrible. Assad is in power. So, the U.S., let's say that the doings of the U.S. were not very effective. And I don't know what the strategy, really, long-term strategy is. What is, like what we would be happy with to achieve in Syria. Can you comment on this? What would be, what would make you happy? And you say that it's good and realistic.
Sure, and then I'm going to take one more question. I saw a hand up in the back there.
Hi, Fred Peterson, prior Marine, also worked for the House and the Senate. How do we square that some of our allies in the Middle East are authoritarian regimes and may develop a greater affinity for Russia and China, particularly as they increase their presence in the region and develop more that they can and are willing to offer in terms of economic aid, military hardware, and consumer products?
So two questions. One is, what do we do about Syria? And the other is, how do we potentially compete with Russia and China? They're a growing influence. So, Mara, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks for those great questions. So on Syria, I can't say that what I'm about to say will make me happy, but it is what I think is realistic and would make the situation marginally better. I do think you want some U.S. force presence there. That's really important to help us understand what's going on in Syria. It helps facilitate any kinetic activity that the U.S. might want to do. It helps facilitate coalition partners, particularly Europeans also having a presence. It helps facilitate that whole of government thing I talked about, so making sure U.S. diplomats can have a presence, or say that non-governmental organizations can have a presence. So I think you would want to continue a U.S. military presence. If you all remember, in December, the president tweeted out that we were going to withdraw from Syria. I think the Pentagon's response was, by withdraw, you mean stay? And so it appears as though there is going to be some presence. That continues. I would like that presence to be particularly focused on ISIS. I think Brian is spot on when he says we need to prioritize fighting those sorts of transnational terrorists. And you need to have a bit of a presence to be able to do that. Ideally, the U.S. would also play a role in reconstruction in certain areas, but I don't know if that's actually going to happen. I think the U.S. has not shown a deep interest in trying to fix the extremely ugly situation in Syria. I mean, the World Bank numbers for how to rebuild this place are just mind-boggling. You have literally millions upon millions of refugees that are probably not going to come back anytime soon. So the other area where I think the U.S. can be useful is humanitarian assistance to the Syrian refugees that are spread across and destabilizing places like Lebanon and Jordan. So that's your Syria answer, and I know it is unsatisfying. What do we do about our partners in the Middle East? And I'm just going to amend your question slightly because we don't actually have allies there. We just have partners. So what do we do if they get kind of lured by the other options of Russia and China? I worry that this is something that the U.S. government often worries about, and I probably should worry a lot less about. So first of all, when the Russians give military assistance, they're not actually giving it. They're usually permitting it to be purchased, and it often doesn't arrive, and when it does arrive, it's not terribly capable. So the situation behind Russian military assistance, I've worked with a number of Arab militaries who said, we're sick of the U.S. system. We're never actually going to get those things you said you'd give us, and we're not going to get them qualitatively or quantitatively, and we're just frustrated. We're going to turn to the Russians. And usually what happens is they try to turn to the Russians, and then a year later they say, well, that was really annoying also. And oh, by the way, we don't have the money to pay for it. So on the Russia side, I think we cannot ignore the political role that Putin has been playing in the region. He sort of masterfully talks to everyone and has become sort of the go-to guy. That's not least because he also has a very different level of involvement and interest in the region. So when the U.S. thinks about the Middle East, as much as we may be yo-yoing, we also often have these visions of sort of building these capable states, and that's not really going to happen either. And that's just not where Putin's head is. So he has a lower set of expectations. That's probably not bad, but I don't think he's delivered terribly much for a lot of folks across the region. The Chinese are a really interesting case to figure out. As of now, it seems like their focus on the region is much more economic. It's much more sort of one belt, one road. How do you deal with excess capacity issues? I will be really curious to watch how their security presence then starts to shift. They obviously don't really have one right now, but I think this is sort of an area to monitor over the coming years. In particular, the relationship between the Israelis and the Chinese is kind of a spot to watch going forward. You look at Chinese increasing involvement at Haifa port, for example, just a deepening relationship on a number of levels, even just commercially. You know how have, I think, direct flights from Israel to about 5 cities or so in China. So that will be curious. Their focus will be economic, not security, I assume, for a long time. That doesn't mean that can't shift and that those don't bleed into one another.
Without diminishing my respect for Mara and Brian, which is enormous, I do want to give a different perspective on Syria, because here I do fundamentally disagree with this notion that ISIS should be the priority. I've always thought that was absolutely the wrong mission, completely misidentified. ISIS is not the problem in Syria. ISIS is the symptom of the problem in Syria. The problem in Syria is the civil war. And until we have an answer for the civil war, nothing else matters, and ISIS will be back. Or we'll get son of ISIS, just as ISIS is the son of al-Qaeda. The answer is to deal with the civil war. And very briefly, that is going to require a power-sharing agreement, which will dramatically decentralize power away from Damascus out to the provinces. That's the only way you're going to get any kind of stability and end to conflict that isn't the repression of a new Iranian-backed Assad regime. How would I get there? I've written about this elsewhere. Very simply, I would give far more assistance to the Syrian opposition. I think that the leverage that we get, I agree with Mara and Brian that we get some leverage from simply holding the territory eastern Syria. I think what we found is it is not enough. Right? We're going to need much more leverage, and I think the only way is to threaten the Assad regime with actual defeat. We don't think it's entirely doable. It just requires a much greater effort not much greater, I don't want to make it sound like the surge. It requires a greater effort on the part of the United States that we've never been willing to do. Right? And I think that until that happens, we're either looking at protracted violence and stalemate in Syria, in which ISIS and other groups will continue to thrive, or a Iranian-Russian-backed victory for the Assad regime. And none of those outcomes strike me as satisfying America's interests. So that would be my answer. And by the way, this won't happen under Trump. Right? Absolutely not, never going to happen. Who knows if it would happen under one of his successors, but you asked me for what should happen, that's what should happen. On the question, I'll just add to Mara's point by saying that, look, I completely agree with her point that many times they don't actually like the Russians. By the way, back to my own point, they have the same frustrations we do. Right? It's not like they train these forces better. And by the way, it's not like the British and French do either. Right? It's all the same fundamental problem. Right? I would say that our efforts do help in weaning them away from this. Yes, occasionally they do flirt with it. I think China is by far the much bigger problem because of the political issues, which Ilan in particular mentioned beforehand. These are authoritarian countries. They don't like it when we weigh in on their human rights, their anti-democratic practices. I actually think that it's helpful for us to deal with their militaries. I can't prove it, but I do believe that the Egyptian military showed some restraint in 2011, in part because of their partnership with us. Right? But I also do think that at some level, we may have to face some of these countries with a choice. I don't know what the heck Mr. Erdogan is doing in Turkey, flirting with the Russians. But I actually do agree with the idea that we've got to pose a choice to him. You can either be a NATO ally or you can be a Russian ally. You can't be both.
I would say, so the analyst in me fundamentally agrees with you, Ken, that absolutely the Syrian civil war is the primary issue that was facing the United States from the beginning and is what generated ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra in the country. But from a policy pragmatic perspective, the reality is across administrations are looking out to the future, the sort of reignition of U.S. support to the opposition seems so unlikely that given that reality, focusing on what we do have there and what we're likely to have there is a counter-ISIS mission. I'm not saying analytically that I think that's the right call, but I think just from a policy analysis perspective, that's why our remarks are largely focused on that. I agree that looking into the future, you see an unresolved civil war, but then also multiple overlapping conflicts between the external and internal players, for none of whom ISIS or al-Qaeda are their primary adversary. So we are looking at continued instability that from a CT lens is going to breathe oxygen into extremists. to the gentleman's question in the back, I think in an ideal world, our large-scale foreign military sales programs and large-scale train advise assist programs to Arab militaries, we would have this perfect alignment of existing capabilities, willingness to take U.S. advice and equipment, adapt it to actually smart strategy and operations, and have a political system that we are comfortable dealing with as well. In too many places, you do not have that alignment. You're lucky if you have 1 to 2 of those 4 things. So I think going back to Ilan's report, one, focusing our efforts on these smaller scale missions in countries where you have capable forces who are willing and able to partner with the United States, whether it's in Lebanon, their special operations forces, in Iraq with the CTS, is a good approach. For the large scale programs, whether it's in the Gulf or countries like Egypt, I think we theoretically have leverage, which is the amount of money and arms that we're giving them. Historically, we have never been willing to use that leverage because we are concerned with them going to use the great power competition. I don't know if anyone said it yet, but you're required to on a think tank panel, that they'll go to China or Russia. But as Mara pointed out, those aren't viable options really for them. But I think the more we are actually willing to use our leverage in cases where we have come to a fundamental political or even moral disagreement with the country, it's a policy and political decision that you have to make. But I think it is one that's going to probably remain for the foreseeable future with a few of our partners in the region.
All right, well, we were going to do a second round, but I think we're actually now over time. But there's an opportunity to ask our panelists. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer your questions afterwards. So I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us. Sorry, you can ask afterwards. And for those of you, especially who stayed for the 2.5 hours and the entire thing. And thank you very much to our panelists for this really interesting discussion. And so I think with that, we'll wrap for the day. Thank you.
Thank you.